Hello and welcome to Searching the Scriptures, a daily podcast where Bible topics will be discussed and Bible questions will be given Bible answers. No opinion, just Bible. This episode is in response to a critique of our episodes concerning marriage, divorce, and remarriage made by the website www.standardandfamilycourt.com. In the last 5 episodes, we have discussed God's original plan for marriage from the beginning, the regulations concerning divorce and remarriage under the law of Moses, a look at the context of what Jesus taught in Matthew 19:9, a word study of porneia, and why Jesus used fornication and adultery in the same sentence in Matthew 19 verse 9, if fornication can include adultery. So if you didn't listen to those episodes, we invite you to do so by visiting our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/East End Church of Christ. For this episode, we're going to examine Jesus' other teachings on divorce, as is found in Matthew 5:32, Mark 10 verses 2 to 12, and Luke 16 verse 18, to see if they conflict with what he taught in Matthew 19:9. If you would, though, turn to Matthew 19:9. We're first going to refresh our memories as to what Jesus taught here. Matthew 19:9 in the English Standard Version, which is the version we're going to consistently use, says, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." Now let's go read what Matthew 5:32 says. "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now what is the difference between Matthew 19:9 and Matthew 5:32? Well, first we find out that if you divorce a person except for fornication, you cause the other person to commit adultery. Now this doesn't mean that they immediately commit adultery, but to divorce someone for a reason other than fornication, you make it more likely for your spouse to enter into an unlawful sexual relationship which God doesn't condone, and this might result in marriage. Causing someone else to sin or giving them the opportunity to sin is not something a Christian should be doing, even though responsibility for actually sinning still rests with the one who is sinning. This verse also differs from Matthew 19:9 in that it states that whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now from the context of this verse, that woman, that divorced woman, it is clear that this woman is the one who was divorced in the previous clause. It's not some other woman. It's the woman who was divorced in Matthew 5:32. This divorced woman. Now the final difference is that the verse is silent on whether or not the person who divorces their spouse for fornication or sexual immorality may remarry. Even though this verse is slightly different, it adds to Jesus' teachings in Matthew 19:9. And in fact, some versions have even added, "And he who marries her that is divorced commits adultery," to the end of Matthew 19:9, when in fact that phrase only appears in Matthew 5:32, does not appear in Matthew 19:9 in those manuscripts. Now Matthew 5:32 is not teaching something different. It is just dealing with a slightly different aspect. Now let's go to Mark 10 verses 2 to 12. "And Pharisees came up, and in order to test him, asked, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?' He answered them, 'What did Moses command you?' They said, 'Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away.' And Jesus said to them, 'Because of your hardness of heart he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation God made them male and female. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate.' And in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter. And he said to them, 'Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery.'" This set of verses is the exact same exchange as recorded in Matthew 19, whereas Matthew 5 was during the Sermon on the Mount. Now, what are the difference here between Mark 10 and Matthew 19? Now, Mark adds some details that Matthew left out, while he leaves out some details that Matthew had. Mark adds that Jesus asked the Pharisees what Moses commanded them, while Matthew leaves this question out. The Pharisees' response about what Moses' law said was the same, so there's no real difference there. Matthew splits up Jesus' responses into two parts, God's design for marriage from the beginning and the reason Moses suffered divorce, while Mark combines these two responses into one. Again, no real difference. Third, Mark has Jesus explaining his ultimate teaching on divorce to his disciples privately, while Matthew has Jesus doing so publicly. This again isn't a real difference and doesn't preclude Jesus doing so both times and having to explain it again to his disciples like he had to do on many a topic and many different other times. Next, Mark confirms that women could divorce their husband, while Matthew makes it appear that only men could. This would be counter to the customs of the day, and I'm sure it would have been controversial for many believers to hear. And finally, Mark does not give the exception clause in Jesus' teachings, while Matthew does. We'll discuss whether this omission affects our application for today in the next episode. Let's now quickly examine Luke's account in Luke 16:18. Luke 16:18, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. How does Luke differ from Matthew 19? First, Luke's teaching is not part of an exchange with the Pharisees, which is fine because Jesus taught the same thing in multiple places, like all preachers do. Second, like Mark, Luke also excludes the exception clause in Jesus' teaching on divorce. And finally, Luke adds, whoever marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery, a teaching that is not taught in Matthew 19:9, but from Matthew 5:32. So, having examined these accounts, is there a difference with what Jesus teaches in Matthew 19:9 versus what he taught in Matthew 5:32, Mark 10:2-12, and Luke 16, verse 18? This is a question that we'll seek to answer in the next episode, so we hope you will join us for that. But perhaps you're listening and you're not a Christian. The brethren here in Toronto would love to study the Bible with you so that you could hear the Word of God, believe it, and obey it before it is everlastingly too late. If you'd like to set up a study, you can send us an email at torontoeastendchurchofchrist@gmail.com. On behalf of the East End Church of Christ in Toronto, Canada, I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode. For free online Bible-based material, or to get directions to our meeting place, please visit our website at www.eastendchurch.org. While there, you'll also find links to more of our podcasts, as well as links to the live broadcasts of our services. Should you have any questions about this or any of the other podcasts you may have listened to, you may leave a comment below or email us at torontoeastendchurchofchrist@gmail.com. Please join me, the Lord willing, again in the next episode when we will be continuing our discussion of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Goodbye for now, and have a great day.